Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning if you're in California or the West Coast. This is Lincoln Merrihew of Millward Brown Digital. We're about to get started on our exciting new webinar that looks at some trends in behavior between mobile and desktop in the travel industry. I hope you all can hear me. We do have a lot of people on board, so we're going to walk through this relatively quickly to respect your time. Although we appreciate you taking the time out of your calendar today, even if it's only half an hour, because we know you're all busy. We know there's a lot going on in the space. So with no further ado, we'll get started. So there are two people that are going to be presenting today. One is me. I'm SVP of Transportation at Millward Brown Digital. That covers travel and automotive, as well as Steve Solinsky, who's one of our senior people dedicated to travel at Millward Brown Digital. We're both out of the Boston office, but we have people across the country from Seattle, LA, and points in between. So very quickly, what we're going to walk through today. The first is about Millward Brown Digital. We're going to do very little on that and spend most of the time on insights. So we're going to look at mobile travel behavioral data. That's our focus. And what that means is data we observe on digital devices. So none of this is gathered via survey, none of this is gathered via focus groups or anything like that. This is actual observed behavior from our proprietary panel. We're going to look at desktop versus mobile, again, both behavioral for flight and hotel suppliers. The same thing for OTAs and metas. And then last, we're going to look at some demographic differences between desktop and mobile users, and there's some really interesting ones. So I hope you make it all the way to that section because it's interesting. And then some takeaways. We're going to try to do some Q&A at the end. We may only have 5 minutes for that, and as I said, we have about 160 people registered. You can type in your questions as we go in the interface on the screen, on the WebEx screen. If you come up with questions later, you can email them to us. That's fine as well. And lastly, if you have some coworkers that can't attend this and you think this is dynamite stuff, we are going to be doing company-specific versions of this. So, for example, we could do a webinar just for your company, you and 5 or 10 of your peers, sort of an intimate review, intimate walkthrough in case there are other people you think would benefit from this. Same idea, same approach, but some companies are more comfortable asking questions when it's just their coworkers around versus an entire audience. So with that, we're going to get started. Our mantra is we're the world's leading digital experts in helping clients grow great brands. We're part of Millward Brown Enterprise, which is a broader group that focuses on making great brands, and we're the digital element of that. So as I said, you're going to see a lot of data that has to do with online and digital behaviors. So kind of 4 areas that we cut our solutions into: connecting digital and traditional, optimizing media allocation, expanding consumer and channel insights, and driving ROI. This presentation, because of the differences in desktop and mobile, is really going to focus on challenge number 2. But some of it applies to 1 and 3 as well. So this is really a tip of the iceberg look at some of the differences. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Solinsky. As I mentioned, Steve is our senior-most person in the travel practice out of the Boston office, and a lot of this is his work. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lincoln. And thanks you all again for joining us today. The first slide that we're going to look at here is really just a high-level comparison of mobile versus desktop traffic, with mobile in the lighter shade of gray and desktop in the darker shade. One of the first key trends that we wanted to call out when looking at this data is, in looking at the darker gray bars, you can see that follows your typical seasonality as far as desktop research and booking, but you can see that mobile tends to be a little bit higher in some of the months where travel is being consumed or where folks are really in transit. Part of that has to do with the way that things have been advertised of late over the first half of the year, but in addition to that, you start to get a sense of what type of activities could be happening. We know, like, for example, with the airlines, you're probably going to see a lot more activity that's related to mobile boarding passes and check-in and sort of in travel as opposed to research and booking. And again, what's really important about understanding that is to get a sense of 2 things that are important. One is to understand that there's different seasonalities between mobile and desktop. The key takeaway there is to really focus in on what you release to the market and when. For example, you might want to put out messaging related to features of your mobile app when people are going to be in market or in transit, and you might want to actually launch products and updates to products in down periods to kind of keep that mobile visitation going throughout the throughout the year. This next slide here that we're looking at starts to break things down by individual channel. For each one of these buckets, we looked at Visitation for really the top brands within each set. Starting up top, one of the things that we can see is that the OTAs have a fairly sizable lead in mobile visitation from December through May. There's a couple of reasons for that. First is just the OTAs offer more products. More products equal more opportunity to reach different consumer bases. The second is that really through the first half of the year, first half of 2014, one of the things that the OTAs have been heavily advertising, especially on TV, has been the usage of mobile products. Expedia, for one, has been fairly heavy with that. Hotwire has been another example. Moving down to that first lighter blue line, that's the airline supplier Visitation, and you can see that's another category that has a fairly sizable lead over some of the smaller buckets. The airlines in particular are one of the cases where you see, the trends don't really match what you would expect from typical booking seasonality, with the spike in December and another spike in February and March. Again, that's, our suspicion is that that's pretty much a lot of mobile boarding passes, mobile check-in, checking flight status, things along that nature. You can see like down towards the bottom you have hotel and you have car rental. In both of these cases, they are mobile products that are getting stronger. In fact, since even looking beyond the data set that we're looking at here, you've seen a lot of advances from brands like Hilton and Marriott. You've seen Avis with a fairly large mobile product launch as well. This next slide is looking at, of all of the visits on both desktop and mobile, what share does each one of these travel sub-industries actually see? And one of the things that's worth calling out here is that it's nearly equal across the board. And again, the key takeaway is something that we've been discussing in some of the slides so far, is that while the demand for each one of these products and each one of these types of sites may be fairly similar across both mobile and desktop, the actual consumption and what the products are being used for, it varies very, very differently. Now, since we have our auto expert in the room here, just out of curiosity, Lincoln, how does this compare to what you've seen with the automotive industry?
Some differences and some similarities. So real quickly, in automotive, we have third-party websites, which are much like OTAs, and automaker websites, which are a lot like supplier sites. And they have different seasonality as well, so there are times that we think it reflects where the consumers are in the purchase funnel. So if it's more brand building versus getting ready to buy or act like you're going to buy. So some similarities, some differences. Structurally, they're very similar with third-party sellers and main suppliers, but the seasonalities are different. They're both very complex purchases, though. And one of the things that we've conjectured there is you can do some things on mobile, but other things are just too complex.
Sure.
So,
excellent. Thank you. So as we move ahead, the next couple of slides that we look at will be really comparing visitation on desktop versus mobile. And I think from here we can start to get a sense of, which particular sub-industries are not necessarily strong or weak in mobile. I mean, it's all very much based on what strategies are at play and what type of purchases can be made on each one of the platforms. But we can really start to look at the seasonality and tie that back to one of the things that we mentioned early on in understanding when is a good time to market mobile, when is a good time to launch mobile. So as we're looking at the top half of the slide, the first section that we're looking at is the airline suppliers, and really this is made up of almost every major player in the industry, from American, Delta, Southwest, etc. One of the things that we can see is that you do have this almost inverse relationship in seasonality between mobile and desktop, with mobile being the dashed line on the bottom, where in December, there's much less actual booking activity that's happening overall. It's the low point of the airline booking seasonality. You can see that the visitation between the two sources almost equaled. And as you move forward through the year, you can see that that it's almost moving opposite each other. The number on the right-hand side is the number of mobile visits per desktop visit, and that's a metric that Lincoln and I were discussing as a good way to get a sense of really how brands are adapting to mobile. So for example, in the airline space, I think it's a little bit above 0.6 mobile visits per each desktop visit.
So Stephen, in this chart here, in December, for example, your conjecture was that people might be using mobile in transit.
Mm-hmm.
So if we know bookings are low in December, but we know that there are a lot of people flying in December, is that what you attribute this to? So the lift in mobile, the relatively high point in mobile December could be in transit, checking in as you go, maybe even changing flights as trips get delayed and so forth. And the low point in desktop is the same thing because people are out flying, they're not on their desktop.
Exactly.
Is that how you read that? Okay.
Exactly. So as we're moving down to the hotel suppliers section on the bottom of the page, one thing that I think we'll see with the hotel suppliers that's a little different maybe from some of the other sub-industries is that really the growth and the seasonality between mobile and desktop for the hotel suppliers is almost parallel with sort of the peaks and valleys in your same periods. Part of this could be that while the airline suppliers, for example, it's a high dollar value purchase, and clearly there's a need for different types of tools and booking options both in desktop and mobile for those who need them. In the hotel supplier space, we may be looking at perhaps similar activities that are happening between desktop and mobile. Again, one of the things that I think we'll start to see is perhaps even a little bit of a shift in hotel as we go through towards the end of this year, just because some of the features that have been released in some of the more recent updates to hotel supplier mobile apps are almost starting to bring in some of the features that you would anticipate from an airline supplier and giving consumers a little bit more tools. So it'd be interesting to follow this as we go through towards the end of the year.
So logically, so what you're talking about is some of the hotel iPhone apps where you can book, choose a hotel room, unlock your door, do everything you want to do from your phone. We may start to see that the desktop and mobile become less parallel, and there may be, much like airlines, we may start to see more in-transit use.
Exactly. Moving on, the next slide here, we'll look at both the OTAs, and when we do talk about the OTAs here, we're just talking about overall traffic to the OTAs, not specific to any one path. One of the things that I think we would potentially have anticipated seeing is a greater volume of mobile visits given or a greater proximity of the mobile visits to desktop visits given a lot of the nature of the advertising that we've seen throughout the beginning half of the year. However, because there are two OTAs in particular that are very strong at driving volume at this point, what we still see is that the desktop growth in visitation is outpacing mobile at this point. Examples in this case may be somebody like Booking.com, Hotels.com, both of which have had not necessarily TV advertisements that are geared towards mobile, but more towards just overall booking activity. And I think in cases where that happens, you tend to see a little bit higher desktop usage and clearly desktop bookings in those cases. Both of those brands have done very well at increasing their market share. That's not to say that mobile hasn't been growing, as we can pretty clearly see throughout the beginning half of the year. It's just that right now desktop is at a much higher rate of growth. And last but not least, we look down to sort of the planning and meta. And generally speaking, this is going to be composed of the two biggest brands within the space, which are TripAdvisor and Kayak. And we can sort of see throughout the beginning half of the year that, like what we had seen with the airlines, there's almost an inverse relationship depending on the month. And a lot of that goes back to if you're looking like a TripAdvisor, for example, you have a lot of people who are sharing content. You have a lot of people who are staying at a hotel and then checking in immediately, or they're so far in advance of their travel booking also that they're just starting to gather their research. So you can start to see a little bit of a difference in the seasonality there. But similar to the airlines like we had seen in December, really the mobile visitation is almost equal to desktop visitation. In that case, because a lot of people are sort of in motion as we go. Moving on here, this next slide is comparing the desktop share of unique visitors versus the mobile share of unique visitors. And I think, as far as some of the things that Lincoln and I were looking at here, there's no particular surprises. We know TripAdvisor is a, very large brand. 13% of all mobile travel visits are going to TripAdvisor versus 11% on desktop. And I think one of the other brands that's worth calling out here is, again, looking at Booking.com, which is all the way on the left-hand side as far as the mobile share. you can see that as far as a brand with a single product, which is hotel, they actually capture a very large share of travel visits on desktop, but their mobile presence is actually the lowest of the entire competitive set.
And Steve, do you think any of that has to do with how new they are as a brand to the U.S., let's say? Like they don't have as much legacy activity as some of the others?
It's certainly possible, though I think Booking.com has now been around for long enough that I think they're getting awareness. So just for a little bit of context, if you look at their desktop growth, when they started launching their TV campaign last year, they saw a very large spike. They saw a somewhat of a spike this year in just overall market share, but not as big as they did last year. So I think some of that could be an indication that they're starting to grow in just general awareness.
Right. Okay. So one of the key things to point out about this slide too is because you see a brand that's high mobile or high desktop, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad or good. It really depends on what each of these brands' strategies are. So for example, if Expedia is pushing harder on desktop than mobile because they see an opportunity there, these results are great. If American, on the other hand, is pushing a very aggressive mobile strategy, whether it's before travel or in transit, and less so focusing on desktop, that's great too. So where you are, and this isn't a good or a bad, it's more to what extent does it align with your corporate digital strategies. And if it aligns, that's great, or if it's outperforming, that's great, and if it's not, maybe that's something to investigate.
Okay. So one other really interesting cut that we have for our mobile data here is to try to get a look at the demographics. So what we have on this slide here is comparing the mobile average versus the desktop average for each of the core buckets here. And I think one of the things that's not much of a surprise is that when you're talking about mobile visitation, that this skews a lot younger. Those are the people that are adapting the mobile devices and sort of the more heavy users. What may be a little bit more of a surprise is to look at the income brackets, and that it skews either high on the low end or high on the high end, looking at either the income brackets that are less than 30K or over 100K. Lincoln, you and I have been discussing this as far as the automotive world as well, and I think you saw some pretty similar type of demographic changes there.
Yeah, we did. So on the age basis, mobile users skew younger and desktop users skew older. They're very, very similar. Male, female within a couple of points as well. But we did see that same difference in the income, where there is a skew toward the lower income group that probably just represents the age of the consumers. But then there's also a skew towards the higher end, which may mean either just more affluent younger people or more affluent people in general are on things like smartphones. They're the early adopters. They're the ones to get the best devices sooner, the most comprehensive plans, on the go probably more often with their high-paying jobs and things like that. So we saw the very similar pattern. So age was definitely younger, but incomes had two different camps, a low end and a high end. So what that really says is there's no one-size-fits-all for travel, mobile marketing, or automotive, because you've got a couple of different audiences buried within the overall set. So I wish it was one size fits all. Oh, mobile user, here's what we're going to do, but clearly there's some subgroups or sub-tiers within this.
Exactly, and again, we're only looking at a discussion here with automotive and travel, and as Millward Brown Digital is starting to have more of these mobile discussions. It'll be very interesting to compare how does the retail channel work versus how does even some of the technology and entertainment channels work.
You're absolutely right, because travel and automotive are both very expensive purchases, so you might expect different cuts in the income levels than, let's say, someone researching shampoo on a Procter & Gamble site, or something less expensive, managing their bills with a utility company, something like that. So that's another different level. What's the purchase price typically of the products in question?
Exactly. So there's a lot of text on this slide, so we'll try to highlight things as quick as we can, just as the key takeaways here. So I think first and foremost, it's understanding that there's differences in seasonality that can help drive when do you market your product, when do you launch your product, and are the tools that you're providing the most relevant to your consumer base at the time, just to keep your messaging going. Number two, or number one as we have it listed here, is just getting a sense of the OTA business in itself, and that they are leading the travel world right now in mobile visitation, but we still know that their desktop growth is moving at a much higher pace just because of sites like Booking.com and Hotels.com being a little bit more desktop-centric than mobile-centric right now. As we look at each of these sub-industry share of total, we know that it's almost equal across the board, but that doesn't mean that the consumers are doing the same thing on both devices. You have cases like hotel where right now they may be doing researching and booking activity because of the travel sub-industries. Perhaps it's the lesser expensive and more accessible by mobile device, versus you have the airlines who may be doing two totally separate things with research and booking happening on a desktop and basically trip management, check-in, boarding passes, etc., happening on a mobile device. And sort of last but not least, is sort of in the looking ahead section down below, we are going to continue to develop these mobile insights, and we'll continue to update them as they come in. So that's been our presentation.
So thanks, Steve. Again, we appreciate everyone attending today. We had a whole bunch of registrants, and so two things I wanted to share with you. First, we did have a lot of questions that came in. We'll get to those in just a second. Secondly, if you happen to be working while you are watching this webinar, or know some of your coworkers who'd like to see this presented just as a private audience for one of the companies on, let us know, because we're happy to do that. And we did the same thing for the automotive and probably did 25 or so follow-ups that were just more company specific. People can ask questions in a freer environment. Speaking of questions, we got a couple so far. We'll try to get to as many as we can. The first one is sort of there's two of these, what's actually in our data, this mobile data. It's a combination of smartphone browser, smartphone apps, and tablet browser and tablet apps. So there's 4 different types of data intertwined in here. The data in here aren't cut by app or tablet or phone, but it's basically mobile activity, anything where you're kind of untethered from your world. One of the questions that came in is to what do we attribute Southwest's strength? They were in the upper right, Steve, on both share of desktop and share of mobile.
Sure.
Are they just doing something great, or?
Well, Southwest in general has always had a very strong lead in the airline space, primarily because of their distribution method. Generally speaking, they're not found on many, if any, of the OTAs right now, at least from the consumer point of view. I think there's some business activity. So just knowing that from a sort of market awareness and from a visitation, they've always had a strong lead because there's only one place you can go to find the Southwest flight. So I think some of those characteristics are definitely carrying over. You would expect the airlines that are leading on desktop, assuming that they're providing the mobile check-in and boarding pass tools, to have that same type of lead on mobile as well.
So we expect airlines to have the lead in general because of the in-transit, and Southwest in particular because within numbers for OTAs there are some data on JetBlue and American and everyone else, but for Southwest all the activity is on Southwest's site. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's other airlines that are sort of keeping their distribution just to their own websites, and then that's that's a strength for those airlines. But Southwest in particular, they've always had a very strong lead.
And so one of the other questions I think is related to that. There's the desktop versus the mobile share. Mm-hmm. Other than Southwest, which is part of the previous question, the brands seem to be kind of clustered together. So no one really has broken it open yet, or broken out, if you will. Is that how you read it too, that everyone's still kind of learning as they go?
Yeah, I would say, for sure everyone's sort of learning as they go, and I think, part of that is trying to understand what tools to put in front of their consumer. I think there's always been a race to get out the product that's going to help create that mobile booking very quickly, but for the time being, it seems like the majority of the activity that's happening in mobile is either going to be sort of the inspiration or the research, but that actual booking activity is going to be on the desktop. So I think as everyone starts to figure things out, we'll perhaps see a little bit more movement.
So would you envision then as a follow-up, maybe the interest comes up on your mobile and you do a little bit of research, like maybe I'll go to Cancun or maybe I'll fly this airline. But when it comes to actual booking, you'll then go to the desktop. But then with airlines and presumably in the future with hotels, you'll do your in-transit work on the mobile. So it's almost a sandwich, right? It'd be mobile, desktop, mobile, mm-hmm. A digital sandwich, if you will.
Absolutely.
So that's really interesting too, and that would also imply using different platforms for different points in the funnel. So maybe brand building awareness could be mobile, engagement, booking is desktop, and then sort of during flight or during travel optimization, if you will, experience optimization is through mobile, which could be really interesting. One of the things that we've also looked at is the extent to which a website, whether mobile or otherwise, is an extension of the brand. Right now, from your opinion, do you have a view on how the industry is doing in general? Like, are mobile travel sites still seem to be just get you through the funnel, or is there more brand building, or how do you think the industry is approaching it?
You know, I think a lot in the same way that, you know, a lot of the apps have come out with different functionality that are more geared towards what its consumers are doing. I think, you know, a lot of the mobile websites of late have been about creating a, you know, pretty consistent experience across the board. So, you know, for the hotels and for the OTAs, it's all about developing sites with responsive design that'll work on a phone, that'll work on a tablet, and, you know, basically enabling the tools to be pretty consistent across the board. For the airlines, you know, I'd say there's definitely been, as far as the mobile websites go, perhaps a little bit less focus on the booking and more on, you know, what's my flight status? Do I need to check in for something? You know, where can I find my mobile boarding pass if my flight's delayed? What's the number that I can call to find more information?
Okay, that's good. There's one last question. It's kind of long, so I'm going to try to summarize it as best I can. It plays off our digital sandwich question, which is if you're a supplier, you can build awareness, have people book, and then maintain that relationship during travel. In general, our OTA, if that continues to happen, our OTAs, do you think, at a disadvantage? Because if you're checking into a hotel, you might do that on the hotel site. If you're checking into your airline, getting your boarding pass, you're checking into the airline site. Does that leave OTAs out of the in-transit part of that digital sandwich?
I mean, I think it's maybe perhaps as far as some of the options available. So if you're a hotel, you're launching a you know, mobile product in which you can select a room. Yep. It all depends on if you want to make that kind of technology available to the OTA, I suppose. But I think the OTAs have always been very, you know, savvy about what they're putting out as far as their mobile product. So if the technology exists for them to, you know, replicate some of that, then I'm sure they'll make efforts to do so.
That could really change actually the whole industry, right? To the extent that hotels are okay with you checking in via the OTA, just to keep that mobile experience going. It's really interesting. There are a few more questions. We actually don't have enough time to get to those. We have about a minute left, and more are still coming in. So we have a bank of about 10 questions we won't get to right now. For those who have those, you can reach out to me or Steve. Both our contact information is shown on the slide here. We're happy to answer any of those, and as I mentioned, if you have any interest in us doing the same presentation for within your company exclusively, reach out to us. We're happy to do that. At some point, we'll make copies of this presentation available via the Compete website, or potentially our marketing group will send it out to you. Thanks again for taking the time. We know there's a lot of information. We really tried to cram into 30 minutes. That's because we tried to cram it into 30 minutes because we know everyone has busy schedules and there's a lot going on in the space. So thanks again for the time. And we look forward to any follow-up questions, and keep an eye out for our next one of these in our series of webinars. Could be on retail, could be on financial services. We're working that out. But as we continue to build up our norms and standards for each vertical, we'll be sharing those out. So thanks again very much, and have a great afternoon.